They were told to give up, to go home, but they poured into the streets in greater numbers than before. This wasn't a protest confined to Liberation Square. This spread across the city, across the country. The presidential palace was a target. The road to the national TV station barred by soldiers, tanks and barbed wire.
There are no indications really on the ground now that either the protesters or the military want to engage in a confrontation. Certainly we haven't heard anyone here saying they want to storm into the palace. They clearly are marking their ground from across the barbed wire. Nobody has tried to attack the barbed wire or the tanks or try to cross onto the gates, and therefore the military also does not seem particularly concerned either.
The military tried to take the air out of the protests before they began. It issued a statement saying it would guarantee constitutional changes and people should go home.
The Council has guaranteed the implementation of the following resolution. 1. Ending the emergency law once the current circumstances come to an end. To rule upon the objections filed with the court against the parliamentary elections. To carry out the necessary legislative amendments. To hold free and fair elections in the light of the constitutional amendments.
If this is the statement only, I'm honestly very disappointed from the armed forces. I think this implies that they do support the statement of our former president yesterday, and I don't think this is a support of our demands.
There was widespread anger and disappointment among protesters after rumours about President Mubarak's departure proved premature. In a televised statement, he confirmed he was staying, but transferring powers to his vice president.
I have seen that it is required to delegate the powers of and authorities of the president to the vice president as per the constitution. I am fully aware that Egypt will exit this exit.
If President Mubarak believed his announcement would end the protests, he seriously misjudged the situation. The calls are larger and louder. The demand, he remains president no longer. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera.
Let's give you some of the international reaction now to Hosni Mubarak's refusal to stand down. The Prime Minister of Denmark, Lars Rasmussen, has become the first European Union leader to call for Mubarak's resignation, saying he is history, in his words. The Iranian president, meanwhile, has said that the Egyptian protest herald a new Islamic Middle East free of what he calls US and Israeli interference. The US president issued a statement criticizing Egypt's leaders for failing to follow what he said is a credible, concrete and unequivocal path towards democracy. And Britain's Foreign Minister William Hague says more clarity is needed on exactly which powers Hosni Mubarak is handing over to the vice president.
We continue to urge the Egyptian authorities to express a credible way forward in what President Obama has called clear and unambiguous language, and there remains a need for that today.
Should Mubarak have gone yesterday?
It's not for us to say when the President of Egypt should depart from office or who the President of Egypt should be in the future. That's got to be owned by the Egyptian people. But we do want Egyptians to be able to settle their great political differences in a stable, free, democratic way. That is what Britain has a legitimate interest in.
Let's go live now to London. Barnaby Phillips, who's outside the Egyptian embassy in the British capital, joins us live. Barnaby, what do you read into these different statements that we hear? The UK clearly not wanting to be too committal, but some clearly not wanting to be too committal, but some taking a different line.
Yes, that's right. Harsh words from the Danish Prime Minister, the first Western leader to overtly call for Mubarak to go. He says Hosni Mubarak is history, but a much more cautious approach from Britain. I think that's more typical of the main European countries, if you like. They're in a very difficult situation. They're watching, if you like. They're in a very difficult situation. They're watching events in Egypt with a mixture of anticipation, perhaps some hope, but also a lot of trepidation. They know that from the Western point of view there are bad outcomes, if you like, to what's happening in Egypt. Of course they would fear an Islamist takeover in some way from the upheavals in Egypt, but they also don't want to see an authoritarian crackdown. That's also a bad outcome. They don't want to see blood on the streets. they know at the same time that their ability to influence events is very, very limited. I'll just give you one example. The EU policy chief, Catherine Ashton, she's put out plenty of statements, but her attempts to actually visit Egypt have been consistently rebuffed by the government there. The government says that they're simply too busy to cope with her visit. And we've seen over the last few weeks how difficult it is for the Americans to really influence events on Egypt. Of course, they're being driven by people on the streets there. Well, the Europeans, frankly, have even less influence, if you like. They don't have that multi-billion-dollar aid budget that at least gives the Americans some leverage, not least over the Egyptian military. The Europeans aren't in such a strong position.
Barnaby, EU leaders will undoubtedly be seen by many as towing the American line, perhaps further indicating the erosion of the European policy in general. Meanwhile, there is perhaps some kind of movement behind you. You are close to 10 Downing Street. What can we expect?
There's a small protest going on behind me in front of the Egyptian embassy. Talking to people there, you can see them. I wouldn't say there were more than 50 of them. They hope to get a few hundred. The weather is typically bad in London and it feels like it's going to rain, so I'm not sure whether that prediction is a little bit over-optimistic, if you like. But talking to people here, they say that they've set up groups spontaneously in the last 8 days in solidarity with people in Tahrir Square. They say that they're, like the British government, if you like, under no illusions that they can really influence events, but they want people on the streets in Egypt to be encouraged by these kinds of protests, which are going on in London and, of course, in many other cities around the world. They just want to show solidarity, show, I suppose, perhaps for their own conscience, if you like, some way in which they can be involved during such a momentous time for their friends and family back home.
Barnaby Phillips outside the Egyptian embassy in London, thank you very much. Let's speak now to Huda Abdul Hamid. She is overlooking Liberation Square. Huda, it is 5:30 p.m.